So I installed a brand new clutch, pilot bearing, throwout bearing, everything on this car recently. And there is starting to be a little bit of chirping coming from the throwout bearing, and that's really common. I don't know if it's because the bearing was just the one that came with the kit. I usually buy a Ford Racing one, but the Ford Racing ones have done it too in the past. And as far as I know, the only way to get around that is to use the adjustable quadrant on the Firewall, which I have on this car, to unthread it and tighten the cable so it pulls the clutch pedal down a little more. Because when you barely touch the clutch pedal, it'll stop chirping. And so that's what I'm going to do in this video. Here's an example of what I'm hearing. It's just a light squealing. So what I do to make this adjustment easier is I take a pair of channel lock pliers and I open them up and I put them over the rim of the quadrant, the face part that you adjust. It's a disc part that's connected to the threaded area like this. Here's a picture of it. Now this can be a little bit difficult to understand how it works. When you unthread this, which would be turning it counterclockwise, it is taking slack out of the cable. It's kind of like stretching up the cable, making it have to travel a little bit farther. And what that is really doing is it's like you are starting to push the clutch in. And with the clutches out and the car's in neutral or driving down the road, when you start to put the clutch in, it is pulling the throwout bearing into the diaphragm fingers. So it's making the process happen a little bit sooner. So with me, I'm getting a little bit of a chirping, and as soon as I touch the pedal, it goes away. And so by unthreading this, it's putting a little more pressure on the bearing. It's pulling the cable a little bit tighter and taking that chirp away by putting a little bit of preload on the bearing, which is like pressure. Like if the bearing's just spinning and you start to put preload on it, that's pushing it in to the clutch diaphragm fingers. It's actually starting to put pressure on it. Now this is going to make the clutch grab later. So as you start to let the clutch out, it's going to start grabbing, well, the pedals up a little bit higher than it was before. And so the cable is going into it, which is putting pressure on the face of it, which makes it hard to unthread or thread. And so putting the channel locks on the rim helps grab onto it. And when you start moving it like that, you will hear it start clicking as it rotates if it's this style. So here's an example.
Click. Click.
Every time it clicks, it is locking it into place of the next adjustment.
Alright. There is any, it's hardly there.
So what this adjuster really is for is to adjust where the clutch is catching in relation to the pedal. So if you're letting the pedal out and you want it to catch sooner, you would thread this thing clockwise to get it in. If you're letting the clutch out and you want it to catch later, with your pedal coming up higher and higher, you would go counterclockwise with it. As far as using this to take the chirp away from the throwout bearing, it might not be made for that, but that's what people use it for. That's what I do with it. It might not be good for the bearing. It might be, as far as I know, if the bearing starts squealing, it already has a problem. I don't know if this new bearing I put in here is just a cheap one. Like I said, I've used the expensive Ford Racing ones, and they do it too sometimes, and you just have to adjust them to keep them from chirping. Make sure they have a little bit of preload on them, because from my understanding, that bearing is supposed to be touching the diaphragm fingers all the time. It's supposed to be spinning all the time. So if it starts chirping, you need to put a little more preload on it. If you have an adjustable cable, down at the bottom by where it goes onto the clutch fork, you can loosen or tighten the nuts that are on the cable to move that clutch fork in and out more. And that's basically the same thing as this. The whole idea of this is to not have to go underneath the car and do that, to be able to adjust it from the firewall in the engine bay.